In the autumn of 1347, a ship pulled into the harbour of Messina, Sicily, and the sailors aboard were either dead or dying, dark swellings the size of eggs blooming beneath their arms and along their necks. Tonight, we sail back to that harbour and to all the world that changed in its wake. Settle in now. Let your body grow heavy against whatever holds you. Pull your blanket a little closer if you like, and feel the warmth spread from your shoulders all the way down to your feet. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nowhere you need to be. Just breathe slowly and let the story come to you, the way firelight comes, softly, without asking anything in return. Close your eyes, and let us go back, very gently, to a world that was already old when all of this began. The world of the mid-14th century was a world of deep, particular textures. Imagine standing in a market town in England, or in the great plaza of a northern Italian city, or along the docks of Constantinople, that magnificent crossroads city where Europe leaned against the shoulder of Asia. The year is 1346, and the world smells of hay and horses, of wood smoke curling from low chimneys, of bread baking in stone ovens, of the salt of a nearby sea. Church bells mark the hours. They have done so for centuries. People know the shape of their days the way we know the shape of our hands, almost without looking. Europe in this century was a crowded, striving, complicated place. Cities had been growing for 200 years. Trade routes stretched from the warm ports of the Mediterranean all the way to the cold wool markets of England, through mountain passes and river valleys and vast overland roads that shimmered in the summer heat of Central Asia. Merchants travelled those roads with bolts of silk and bales of spice, with amber and furs, with silver and glass. The world was connected in ways that most people who lived inside it could not quite imagine, because the connections happened at the edges of their lives, in the holds of ships they would never board, along roads they would never walk. And it was along those same roads, in the holds of those same ships, that something was coming. To understand where it came from, we have to go back even further, not just to the 14th century, but to the deep, almost unimaginably distant past. The bacterium that would cause the Black Death, a tiny and ancient thing called Yersinia pestis, had been evolving for roughly 7,000 years. 7,000 years. Long before the pyramids were built, long before any written language set down a single word, this bacterium was quietly changing, adapting, learning to live in new hosts and move through new worlds. Around 3,800 years ago, during the late Bronze Age, it developed the ability to travel through fleas, small, almost invisible creatures that lived in the fur of rats, on the bodies of animals, in the cracks and seams of wooden ships, and from that moment the bacterium had a way to move. It had moved before. It had caused an earlier pandemic, what scholars later called the Plague of Justinian, which swept through the Byzantine Empire beginning in the year 541 and returned again and again for 2 centuries, its waves rolling across the Mediterranean world like slow tides, taking people with them, and then, for a while, retreating. It was the same bacterium, the same ancient patient thing, doing what it had learned to do. And then, for a time, it quieted, not disappeared, just quieted, the way a storm quiets between squalls, gathering itself somewhere out on the dark water. In the 1340s, something set it moving again. Where exactly it came from, where it first re-emerged in this second great pandemic, is something historians and scientists still debate very gently among themselves. There is evidence pointing toward Central Asia, toward the great steppes and trading cities of what is now Kyrgyzstan and surrounding regions. There is evidence suggesting China or the Middle East. The plague, being neither literate nor interested in leaving records, did not announce its origins. It simply moved, the way diseases do, along the routes that people had built, through the gaps that commerce had opened, travelling in the bodies of rats and the bodies of fleas, and eventually, terribly, in the bodies of human beings. What we know with more certainty is where it entered the story of Europe. Picture the Crimean Peninsula, that tongue of land that pushes down into the Black Sea. In 1346, the city of Caffa sat at its southern edge, a Genoese trading port, a busy, prosperous, noisy place where the great overland Silk Road routes met the sea. Caffa was a city of warehouses and docks, of merchants speaking a dozen languages, of ships waiting in the harbour like patient animals. It was surrounded by walls. And in 1346, it was surrounded also by an army. The Golden Horde, the Mongol-descended empire that ruled the steppes, had laid siege to Caffa. Their leader was a man named Jani Beg, and his army camped outside the walls in the way that medieval armies did, settling into a long, grinding siege, waiting for hunger and time to do what swords could not. But something was happening inside that army. Men were falling sick, the dark swellings were appearing, the fevers were rising, and soldiers were dying not from wounds, but from something none of them could see or name. And this is the moment that would change everything, the moment that would reach forward through time and touch every corner of the world then known to Europeans. The Mongol army began to catapult its dead over the walls of Caffa. The Genoese merchants and defenders inside the city threw the bodies into the sea as quickly as they could. But it was already too late. The plague was already inside the walls. It may have been inside before the catapults began. The siege was collapsing anyway, because the Mongol army was dying faster than it could fight, and so the Genoese ships in the harbour of Caffa loaded what they could and fled, and they took the plague with them. They did not know they were carrying it. How could they? The rats were in the hold, the fleas were on the rats, and some of the sailors, already infected, were beginning to feel that first strange chill, that first deep ache behind the eyes that they might have attributed to the sea air, to exhaustion, to the particular misery of a long voyage. The ships moved out across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, stopping at Constantinople, at Messina in Sicily, at Genoa and Venice and Marseille. At every port the plague came ashore, and the world it was entering had no preparation for it at all. There is something deeply human in the way that people of the 14th century first responded to what was coming, or rather, in the way they did not respond, because they did not know what was coming. They had heard rumours. Word travelled along the same trade routes as the plague itself, and the rumours that preceded it were terrible. Stories came from the east of a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, of whole cities emptied, of the roads of Asia thick with the dying. But rumours from far away are easy to hold at a distance. The church bells still rang in the morning, the market still opened, life still had its shape. When the ships arrived at Messina in October of 1347, those Genoese ships from Caffa, the harbour authorities were alarmed enough to order them out of the port almost immediately. But almost immediately was not soon enough. The plague had already come ashore. Within weeks it was spreading through Sicily, and by the end of the year it was moving north and west, carried by ships and people and rats and the invisible, tireless fleas that needed no road, no map, no plan. Let us slow down here and walk more quietly through what happened next, because what happened next is not only a story of catastrophe, though it was certainly that. It is also a story about how human beings respond when the world changes in ways they cannot understand. And that part of the story is worth holding gently. In Italy, the plague arrived in a world that was, in many ways, the most sophisticated in Europe. The great city-states of the north, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, were places of commerce and learning and art, of remarkable organization and civic pride. They had systems of government, networks of trade, archives full of records. They had, in many respects, more to lose than any other part of Europe, and they knew it. And so, in the face of something utterly unprecedented, they began to do something remarkable. They began, slowly and imperfectly, and often too late, to think systematically about how to stop a disease from spreading. It began simply enough, with rules. Cities in northern Italy started issuing orders forbidding travellers from infected areas to enter their gates. Some ordered the destruction of textiles and goods that had been in contact with the sick, understanding intuitively that the disease could move through objects as well as people, even if they had no idea of the mechanism by which this happened. And gradually, over the second half of the 14th century, those intuitions hardened into regulations, into what we would recognize today as quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, because 40 was a number of deep spiritual significance in that world, the number of days Christ spent in the desert, the number of days the flood lasted. Ships arriving in the port of Venice from infected areas were required to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could come ashore. The sick were isolated in hospitals. The healthy who had been exposed were kept apart from those who hadn't. These measures were incomplete, imperfect, and sometimes ignored. But they represented the first systematic attempt in the Western world to contain the spread of disease through organized public action, and they would echo forward across the centuries into every modern public health practice we now take for granted. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay in the autumn of 1347 for a little while longer, and then move very slowly through the years that followed. In Italy, the eyewitnesses were numerous and often eloquent, because Italy was a land of writers. Among them was a man named Giovanni Boccaccio, a Florentine who would survive the plague and write about it in the preface to his famous work, The Decameron, a collection of stories told, within the fiction of the book, by a group of young people who had fled to the countryside to escape the plague in the city. His description of Florence in 1348 is one of the most vivid and heartbreaking documents in all of literary history. He wrote of the pits dug outside the city walls, into which bodies were layered like cargo, sprinkled with earth, then more bodies layered on top. He wrote of people dying alone in their houses, unattended, their deaths discovered only when the smell reached the neighbours. He wrote of oxen wandering through the empty streets, of the complete collapse of the social order, not all at once, not cleanly, but gradually, in the way that order always collapses when it is pushed beyond what human beings can bear. There was a man named Agnolo di Tura who buried his 5 children with his own hands. He wrote simply, "And no bells tolled, and nobody wept no matter what his loss, because almost everyone expected death." There is something in that sentence, the particular flatness of it, the quiet at its centre, that tells us more about the emotional texture of that time than any statistics can. And yet, people kept going. They kept burying each other, even when the cemeteries were full and they had to dig new ground. They kept writing things down. They kept praying. They kept, in the small and ordinary ways that human beings always do, reaching for something that felt like life continuing. Let us cross the water now and follow the plague north and west toward England. Let us do it slowly, the way ships move, with the creak of timber and the smell of salt water and the slow shifting of the horizon. England in 1348 was a kingdom that had been, by the standards of the age, prosperous and busy. It was in the midst of the 100 Years' War with France, that long, complicated conflict over crowns and territories that would in fact last considerably more than 100 years and consume enormous amounts of treasure and blood. English armies had recently won a famous victory at the Battle of Crécy. The king, Edward III, was a formidable figure, and there was a quality of confidence, even swagger, to the English court in those years. The country was not wealthy by later standards, but it was a functioning, organised kingdom, with towns and abbeys and markets and roads, with fields of wheat and barley stretching out across the rolling countryside, dotted with the white shapes of sheep. The plague came to England in June of 1348. A seaman arrived at the port of Weymouth on the south coast of Dorset, a small harbour town where ships from the English province of Gascony, in what is now southwestern France, regularly docked. This seaman was the first confirmed case in England. He arrived sick. He may not have known he was sick, and from Weymouth the disease began its slow, terrible journey across the country. Picture Weymouth in June, the long evenings of an English summer, the smell of the sea, the sound of gulls. It would have been a scene of ordinary harbour life, ropes and barrels and the calling of merchants and dock workers, the creak of ships against their moorings. And somewhere in that ordinary scene, unwitnessed and unremarked, something passed from one world to another. From Weymouth the plague moved east and north, following the roads and rivers. Bristol was one of the first major cities to be struck. Bristol, that busy western port, with its narrow medieval streets and its great church, and its docks full of goods from across the known world. The chroniclers who wrote about Bristol's experience used language that has stayed with us for 7 centuries. One writer described the streets of Bristol as so full of the dead that the living could barely pass. The grass grew in the marketplace, he wrote, because no one came any more to buy or sell. By autumn, the plague had reached London. London in the 14th century was a very different city from the London we might picture. It was small by later standards, perhaps 60 or 70,000 people crowded within and around its ancient walls, but it was intense, teeming, full of noise and smell. The streets were narrow, often so narrow that the upper stories of the houses on either side nearly touched, blocking out the sky. Sewage ran in the gutters. Rats were everywhere. The conditions that epidemiologists would later recognize as ideal for the spread of bubonic plague were simply the ordinary conditions of medieval urban life. Nobody thought of them as dangerous because they had always been there, and nothing so catastrophic had come from them before. By November of 1348, the plague was firmly established in London. The cemeteries of the city filled within weeks. Emergency burial grounds were consecrated, fields outside the city walls, blessed in haste by bishops who could see what was coming. The great East Smithfield Cemetery, one of these emergency sites, has been excavated by archaeologists in modern times, and what they found in the soil has helped us understand the plague in extraordinary new ways. The bones carefully laid out, row on row, and in the bones themselves, the genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis, that ancient bacterium, identifiable still after 700 years in the darkness of the London clay. It is a strange and moving thing to think about, those bones, and what they held, and how they have spoken across the centuries to scientists with tools the people who were buried there could never have imagined. From London, the plague moved on, north through the Midlands, into the Welsh valleys, up through Yorkshire and into the far north of England, to the cold counties of Durham and Cumberland, already weakened by years of Scottish raids, their populations thin and their resources depleted. The plague arrived in York in May of 1349. By the summer months, June, July, August, those long northern summers when the light lasted almost to midnight, it was moving through every corner of the country. It took the disease approximately 500 days to traverse the whole of England from south to north, 500 days, and in those 500 days somewhere between 40 and 60% of the English population died, 40 to 60%. Pause with that for a moment, not with horror, but with the kind of quiet, deep attention that such a number deserves. In a village of 100 people, 60 were gone. In a town of 1,000, perhaps 500. In London, tens of thousands. The abbeys and monasteries were devastated because monks and nuns, who cared for the sick as an act of religious duty, were among the first and most vulnerable to die. The clergy, who had been so central to every aspect of life in that world, were thinned terribly. Some parishes were left without any priest at all, and the 100 Years' War, that great national project, simply stopped. Edward III's campaigns in France were suspended. The armies that had fought at Crécy came home to a country that was barely recognisable. There was no one to fight with, and nowhere to fight for, when the fields were empty and the village streets were quiet. But let us breathe here for a moment. Let us slow the story down, the way the plague itself slowed in the winter months, when the cold discouraged the fleas and the disease became less transmissible, when there were stretches of ordinary life between the waves of dying. Because even in this story, maybe especially in this story, ordinary life kept happening. Children were born, harvests were gathered, even by insufficient hands. People found each other in the emptiness and built new households. Letters were written, songs were sung, food was cooked and eaten and appreciated, as food always is when life has reminded you to appreciate it. The treatments that physicians offered were, of course, almost entirely ineffective, because nobody in the 14th century understood what was happening at the level of bacteria and immune response. But that does not mean they were without logic within the framework of knowledge available at the time. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of humours, the idea that the body was governed by 4 fluids, blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, and that health was a matter of keeping them in balance. Illness was an imbalance, and treatment was a matter of restoring the balance through various means. Bloodletting was common, drawing blood from a vein near the site of the buboes, those terrible dark swellings that appeared in the armpit, the groin, the neck. The logic was that the corrupted blood should be removed before it could spread its corruption further. Sweating was also used because sweating was understood to be the body's way of purging impurity. Patients were wrapped in wet blankets, given strong medicines, placed near fires. There were strange and tender remedies involving pigeons, live pigeons, held against the swellings to draw out the venom, in the belief that the vital warmth of the animal could pull the poison from the body. These treatments did not work, but they represent the best that the available knowledge could offer, and the physicians who offered them often paid with their own lives for staying close to the sick. If a physician believed the plague was a punishment from God, and many did, drawing on scriptural precedent, the plagues of Egypt, the pestilence sent upon David's people, then the treatment might be confession, prayer, and a kind of loving spiritual attendance on the dying. There was a tenderness in this approach, even if it offered no cure. It meant that people did not die entirely alone. It meant that hands were held and words were spoken, and the last things said before the end were sacred ones. In the Middle East, meanwhile, the plague was writing its own terrible chapters. Cairo was, in the mid-14th century, the largest and most magnificent city in the Mediterranean world, larger than any city in Europe, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, a centre of Islamic learning and trade and culture, a city of minarets and busy markets, of scholars and merchants and artists and pilgrims. When the plague reached Cairo, it struck with the same force it had brought to every other great city. The demographic catastrophe was enormous. The theological response in the Islamic world was different from the Christian response in an interesting way. Muslim theologians had a tradition around the plague, a set of hadith, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that addressed it directly. If plague struck a Muslim, it was to be understood as a martyrdom, a gift from God, a merciful death that guaranteed the status of a martyr in paradise. This meant that the official religious attitude was not to flee, not to isolate, not to take preventive measures, but to remain in place and to meet whatever came with prayer and acceptance. In practice, as always, the gap between official theology and human behaviour was significant. People fled. They loaded what they could onto animals and left the cities, spreading the disease along the roads as they went. But the official attitude meant that there was less institutional apparatus for containment in the Islamic world than there would be in northern Italy. No quarantine orders, no systematic isolation of the sick. The plague moved through the Middle East with devastating speed, killing perhaps a third of the population, a proportion comparable to what happened in Europe. There was a scholar in Cairo named Ibn Battuta, one of the great travellers of the medieval world, who had journeyed across Africa and Asia and beyond. He had seen things that no other person of his era had seen, and when the plague came, even he was not exempt from its shadow. He lost people he knew, He recorded what he witnessed, and his records, along with those of other Muslim writers, poets, physicians, scholars, bureaucrats, give us a window into the experience of the plague across a vast swath of the world that European accounts alone cannot provide. Now, let us return to Europe and to the longer aftermath of what had happened. The first wave of the plague, that great catastrophic sweep from 1347 to 1353, was followed by silence, a strange, echoing silence, like the silence after a very loud sound. The cities were emptier, the fields were emptier, the roads were quieter. The church bells rang for a reduced congregation on those occasions when there was anyone left to ring them. And then, gradually, carefully, life began to reassemble itself around the gaps. What happened to European society in the generations after the Black Death is one of the most fascinating and complex stories in all of history. Complex precisely because it involves so many contradictions. Terrible things happened, but so did things that, in the long perspective of history, look surprisingly like change, like the loosening of old constraints, like the slow opening of new possibilities. Consider labour. Before the plague, Europe, and England in particular, was a feudal society, one in which the vast majority of ordinary people were bound to the land, to the village they were born in, to the lord who owned that land. They owed labour, they owed dues, they had very little freedom of movement and very little leverage to improve their condition. The lord needed them, but he needed them in a world where there were always more of them than he strictly required, where the surplus of labour meant that a peasant who demanded better conditions could simply be replaced. After the plague, all of that changed. There were not enough workers. Fields that needed ploughing could not be ploughed because the people who had always ploughed them were dead. The lords of manors found themselves in the extraordinary position of needing to attract labour, needing to offer wages, better conditions, some form of inducement to get their land worked at all. And the peasants, the survivors, understood this. They began to ask for more. They began to move, to leave the villages that their families had worked for generations and go in search of better wages, better conditions, more freedom. The landlords and the nobles resisted this fiercely. Laws were passed in England and across Europe, attempting to fix wages at their pre-plague levels, attempting to restrict the movement of workers, attempting to put the genie back into the bottle. But the genie would not go back. The world had changed too much. The old ratios of people to land, of workers to lords, had been fundamentally altered by the deaths of the plague, and no law could restore what the disease had taken. The resentment built. It built over decades, through the second half of the 14th century, as the landlords tried to hold wages down and restrict movement, and the workers and peasants felt the injustice of it acutely, because they knew in their bones that the world had changed and that they deserved to share in the change. In England, this resentment boiled over in 1381, in the uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt, a remarkable moment when ordinary men and women, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, marched on London and briefly seized the Tower. The revolt was suppressed. Its leaders were executed. But the long arc of what it represented could not be reversed. Over the following centuries, serfdom in England ended. Not because of one rebellion, but because of the slow, grinding pressure of a changed demographic reality that the plague had created. It is one of history's stranger ironies that one of the most catastrophic events in human experience contributed, in the long run, through mechanisms that were cruel and indirect and took generations to work through, to the expansion of human freedom. The effects on culture and thought were equally profound, though harder to trace with the same precision. The plague infected art. It infected it literally, because so many artists and craftspeople and patrons died, disrupting workshops and projects and schools of technique. But it also infected it spiritually, in the way that any great encounter with mortality must. The image of death as a figure, skeletal, dancing, reaching for the living without regard for rank or wealth or virtue, became suddenly ubiquitous in European art and literature after the plague. The danse macabre, the dance of death, was painted on church walls from Paris to Poland, a procession in which a grinning skeleton leads kings and popes and peasants alike in the same final dance. The message was both terrifying and, in its way, democratic. Death made no distinctions. The plague had made no distinctions. What you were, what you owned, what you believed, none of it protected you, and the art of the age knew it. There were also subtler effects on language and literature. In England, the plague helped accelerate a shift that was already underway, the shift from Latin and French as the languages of serious written discourse toward English, the vernacular language of ordinary people. Before the plague, many of the clerks and administrators who wrote in Latin had been trained in the church, which had suffered devastating losses. There were not enough Latinists left in some places. English had to fill the gap, and into that gap, a few generations later, came writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales, written in vivid, earthy, gorgeous English, would lay the foundation of an entire literary tradition. Boccaccio's Decameron, too, was written in Italian, not Latin. The plague did not cause either of these literary achievements. Great writers are not made by disaster alone, but the displacement of the old order, the clearing away of the old certainties, created space in which new things could grow. Let us slow down even further now. It is important, as we reach the end of this story, to hold all of it together. The catastrophe and the change, the dying and the surviving, the loss and the strange, unexpected growth that came from the loss. Human history is never a simple story. It does not divide neatly into tragedy and progress. It is always both at once tangled together, the good growing out of the terrible the way wildflowers grow on the site of something burned. The plague did not end in 1353. That was only the end of the first great wave. It returned. It returned in 1361 and 1362, killing in England roughly 20% of a population that had only begun to recover. It returned again in the 1370s and in the 1380s, and throughout the 15th century, each outbreak smaller than the one before, but no less devastating for the communities it touched. It recurred in various places around the world until the early 19th century. The European population did not recover to its pre-plague numbers until the 16th century, not for 200 years after the first great wave had passed. 200 years, 2 full centuries of living at reduced numbers, of feeling in the landscape of every town and village the phantom presence of the people who were not there. Abandoned farmhouses slowly swallowed by vegetation, fields that had been cultivated for generations reverting to scrub and woodland, empty spaces in the rows of choir stalls in abbeys, in the benches of guild halls, in the family lines of the nobility and the peasantry alike. And through all of it, all those centuries of recurrence, all those waves of dying and recovering, people did what people always do. They kept going. They repaired what was broken. They made new things in the spaces left by the old. They argued about God and medicine and justice. They fell in love and had children and planted crops and built buildings and wrote things down. They were afraid, and they were brave, and they were selfish, and they were generous, often in the same moment, often in the same person. There is something deeply human in that picture, in the sheer ordinary persistence of people in the face of something so enormous. The Black Death was not, in the end, only a story about dying. It was also a story about how human beings change under pressure, about how societies, slowly, unevenly, sometimes painfully, adapt to new realities, about how the world that comes after catastrophe is always different from the world that came before, but also always continuous with it, because the people who make the new world are the people who survived the old one, carrying with them everything they knew, everything they loved, everything they had lost. The The Genoese ships that sailed from Caffa in 1347 could not have known what they carried. The sailors who were sick in their hammocks in the hold, as the ship moved through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, did not know what their illness would become. The harbour-master at Messina, who ordered the ships out of the port, knew only that something was very wrong. The monks in their abbeys and the merchants in their warehouses and the peasants in their fields knew only, when the plague came, that people were dying and that they might be next. They faced it without any of the knowledge we now have, without any understanding of bacteria or immune systems or the role of fleas and rats in the transmission of disease, without antibiotics, which would not exist for another 600 years, without anything really except each other and whatever faith or philosophy they had brought with them into that moment, and most of them, enough of them, made it through. The night is very quiet now. The fire has burned down to embers, and the embers are the same warm red that fires have always been, in every century, in every country, wherever human beings have gathered around light and warmth and story. 7 centuries separate us from the world of the Black Death, and yet we are connected to it, connected by the genes of the people who survived, by the laws that were written in response to it, by the literary traditions it shaped, by the public health systems whose foundations were laid in the quarantine orders of northern Italian cities in the late 14th century. Every time a health authority isolates a disease, every time a border is closed to prevent the spread of illness, every time a doctor thinks systematically about how to protect a community rather than just an individual, there is a thread, very long and very faint, that runs back to those Italian city-states, to those first fumbling, imperfect attempts to contain something that had never been contained before. We carry the past with us, whether we know it or not. We carry it the way the ships carried their cargo, mostly without thinking, not always knowing what we have in the hold. The seaman who arrived at Weymouth in June of 1348 is long forgotten. We don't know his name. We don't know what he looked like, or what he thought about, or whether he had a family waiting for him somewhere. He is a single entry in a chronicle written by Grey Friars at King's Lynn, a brief and barely witnessed moment at the threshold of one of the great turning points in human history. And yet, in some sense, his arrival, that moment when he stepped off the ship and onto English soil, already carrying within him what would change everything, is one of the most consequential moments of the last 1,000 years. History is full of such moments, small, ordinary, almost invisible pivots on which enormous things turn. A ship in a harbour, a flea on a rat, a sick man stepping ashore in the long light of an early English summer. Let that image rest with you now. The harbour at Weymouth, 7 centuries ago, quiet in the summer morning. The sound of the water against the wooden dock, the crying of the gulls overhead, clean and sharp and indifferent, the ships riding gently at their moorings, the town just waking, its streets still empty, the smell of bread beginning somewhere, the church bell not yet rung. Just an ordinary morning at the beginning of something enormous, just the world, being the world, on the edge of a change it could not yet see. You are very still now. Your breathing is slow and even. The story is settling around you like a blanket, like warmth, like the particular comfort of knowing that you are here, that you have always been on the far side of every catastrophe that history has ever recorded, that the people who came before you found ways through things that must have seemed, in the thick of them, impossible to survive. They survived, and their survival, in all its messy and complicated and deeply human fullness, is what made the world that made you. The harbour is quiet now. The ships are still. The water moves gently against the dock in the old, familiar way that water has always moved, without urgency, without memory, without anything except the simple, continuous fact of itself. Somewhere on the other side of those centuries, the world rebuilt itself. It always does. It always has. And there will come a morning, as there has always come a morning, when the light arrives and the birds begin, and the long night of whatever darkness has come is over, and the world begins again, ordinary and extraordinary at once, just as it has always been, just as it will always be, patient and warm and full of the deep, quiet possibility of what comes next. Let yourself drift now. Let the harbour fade. Let the story carry you down into the deep, warm current of sleep, where nothing is required of you, and everything is well, and the world goes on in its ancient, unhurried way, and you go on with it, resting, breathing, held safely in the great long story of all the people who were here before you, and found their way through and left you this world, this night, this quiet. Sleep well. The morning will come in its own time, as it always does, unhurried and sure.